Dr. Jean Redpath from the Dullah Omar Institute at the University of Stellenbosch. Good afternoon to you, Doc, and thank you for your time once again. I suppose let me pick up from where my colleague Zaylene Merrington ends her report. There was a whole process that was meant to appoint a new substantively appointed NDPP. It came out and said, despite interviewing 6 individuals, none of them we deem to be suitable for appointment to this position. So what made those individuals not meet the threshold of suitability and Andy Mothibi? So I guess we're speaking about Andy Mothibi. What has he got going for him as he takes office?
Well, it's really unfortunate that Advocate Mothibi was not part of that interview process, so that the public could also get to know him and gain confidence in how he presents. The Department of Justice was quite in favor of Advocate Kanile being NDPP, but in the interview process, she did not interview very well. So we don't know how Advocate Mothibi would have fared in a similar interview process. And I think the reason he did not put his name forward is precisely because what your intro said, he actually only has about 2 years in office, which is really a very short time for a national director to make the kind of changes that we would hope to see. In many ways, whoever is NDPP suffers from the same constraints, which is a legislative framework that in many ways sets up the National Prosecuting Authority to fail. And he's going to come up against many of those same constraints. The one advantage that he has over Batoy is that the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption from 2024, August 2024, became a permanent structure. And in the last year of Batoy's office, actually had a sufficient number of investigators. Prior to that, the NPA had only 35 investigators. In other words, it was highly reliant on the investigations done by SAPS or by the Hawks, which are also within the SAPS. So in that respect, Mothibi will have an advantage. But in all the other constraints that the NPA faces, he will be in a similar position to Advocate Batoy.
We'll talk about those constraints in a moment, but I want us to lean in on his background for a moment longer. He comes straight from the SIU, and in recent years we've seen the SIU doing the work of civil recoveries of proceeds from corruption, fraud, and the likes, and their track record has been hailed, at least in the last few years, that they've really done a lot to recover and do recoveries. But he also has background in the magistracy, at some point having served within the magistracy. Just on the aspect of the SIU background and experience, there's always this interesting interlinkage between the work that the SIU does and the standard and threshold it has to meet, and then it making referrals to the NPA to say, from the work we were doing on this particular institution, we believe you could prosecute, you could pursue prosecutions. Does that count for anything in our favor as a people wanting to see many of these cases that were referred from the SIU, but perhaps losing momentum once they land on the desk at NPA, that perhaps we could see some movement in that regard?
So I think the problem with the SIU referrals has been they are not fully investigated and completed dockets. They are merely sort of one-line recommendations saying, we think this person should be prosecuted. And the standard of evidence obtained in those cases is usually not at the level which is beyond reasonable doubt that the NPA needs to prosecute. So in very many instances, the NPA has to refer the case back to the Hawks or the SAPS to investigate further. And so what we've seen is a very disturbing trend of, I think, over the last 3 years, 580 prosecutions per year on average were referred by the SIU to the NPA, and we don't see the results from that. So The problem is that the SIU is focused on recoveries, and it's a kind of an incidental thing where they identify someone who may or may not be guilty of a crime, and it's not in a state that is ready for the NPA to prosecute. And maybe that linkage is something that Advocate Mothibi will in particular be able to fix, how that referral process works, because of his knowledge of the other side of the referral process.
So you mentioned the Investigative Directorate Against Corruption, IDEC. In her farewell message, Advocate Shamila Batoyi spoke about the need to strengthen those institutions within the NPA, but also to give the NPA a degree of institutional independence. She made the interesting point about how Advocate Mothibi goes from being an accounting officer at the SIU to the NPA, where he is no longer accounting officer. To what extent does that put him at a disadvantage? That in terms of attracting skills and being able to offer competitive salaries, for example, for investigators, forensic investigators, data analysts and the like, for institutions such as IDEC, now he's on a very different path from what he is used to and accustomed to at the SIU.
Yes, so precisely that is one of the key constraints faced by the National Prosecuting Authority. There is a set salary scale. The occupational specific dispensation that was meant to place those salaries in alignment was not done correctly, and ended up in a situation where some senior managers actually earn less than people of a lower rank than them. That hasn't been resolved. The top 14 positions in the NPA, all the directors of prosecutions, the deputy national directors, those are all appointed by the president and can only be fired by the president. So Advocate Mothibi, like Advocate Batoyi, is faced with who is already there. He has no ability to make changes to the most senior staff members. Those people serve for a term that will exceed his almost certainly, because unlike the national director, whose term of office is 10 years, unless he or she reaches age 65, the directors of public prosecutions and the deputy national directors serve from however old they are now until 65. And in some instances, that could be 10, 15, 20 years. And so those people have a really strong impact on how well the NPA operates, because the role of the national director is a little bit removed from the front lines. These people are more on the front lines. And if they are not doing their job well, it is very difficult for the national director to hold them to account in any kind of real way. We saw how it took 2 years for the president to respond to Advocate Batoyi's request that Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions Childcare in South Gauteng be considered for removal. He's already served around 13 years. So it means that the National Prosecuting Authority is not dynamic. It's not one that brings in new skills and new blood. It cannot attract the best and the brightest. Yeah. And in fact, most prosecutors are not even lawyers, and that is a real concern.
Say a bit more about that. Most prosecutors are not even lawyers. Are you saying in the sense of being an attorney or an advocate, having gone into private practice before? And do you believe that matters and would put them at an advantage?
So I think Advocate Cronje spoke a little bit at length in her interview about this key problem. People can enter the prosecuting authority straight from a 4-year LLB, and although there is this aspirant prosecutor program, there's no certified qualification that puts them on a level with attorneys or advocates. And the kind of experience that they get on the job is in no way equivalent to what attorneys and advocates go through. Now, the problem with that is when they are litigating matters in court, they are faced with attorneys and advocates who have been through a much more rigorous process.
Yeah, I get that. I just needed a bit of clarity on that. So we are on to, it would be NDPP number 12, if you consider both substantively appointed and acting over the number of years from 1998, from Bulelani Nguka all the way to Shamila Patoyi and now Advocate Andy Mothibi. We've been saying he doesn't have a lot of time in office, 2 to 3 years tops. What can he realistically achieve? If Advocate Patoyi says her focus was on rebuilding what was effectively a hollowed out and shattered organization, what can Advocate Mothibi do with the little time that he has in office?
So I think many of the politicians were actually correct in identifying that he should look at the current cases that they have either in investigation or already enrolled at court, the high-profile matters, and he should closely watch and encourage those to be resolved as quickly and efficiently and with the best results possible. And that may need additional skills. It's quite correct that all the skills necessary are not necessarily in-house, the forensic accountants, et cetera, So that will require going through a Section 38 process, which requires the Minister, the Director General of Justice, and the Minister of Finance all to be involved. If he can smooth that process, the current minister is very much a fix-it person. She is available to do that, and the Director General of Justice, who it seems might have been standing in the way during Shamila Patoyi's term, has been suspended. So there is opportunity for that process to work much more efficiently than it has in the past. I think he should also pay attention to the prosecution policy. Other jurisdictions in the world have much more detailed guidance on difficult to prosecute crimes such as money laundering, which is so important for the FATF grey listing, which we will face again at the end of this year, another evaluation. And if we cannot show sufficient prosecutions and convictions on money laundering, we may well go back onto the grey list, and that's something that should be an absolute priority. We don't want to be on the grey list. So prosecution policy and guidelines that can guide the prosecutors is key.
Great stuff. I really appreciate your insights this afternoon. Dr. Jean Redpath from the Dullah Omar Institute at Stellenbosch University, weighing in on the start of the new, albeit short term in office for Advocate Andy Mothibi.